So, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Arcserve webinar. My name is Armin Jihanian. I'm the pre-sales consultant for Arcserve, and in today's session, we'll be taking a look at the new features in Arcserve UDP 6.5. Specifically, we're going to take a look at a handful of the new features, and along with talking about what they are, show a bit of a demo on how they work within the product. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording link available afterwards. Also, if there are any questions during the session, please feel free to type those questions in the chat or the questions panel, and we will have some time at the end to go through those questions. With that, during today's session, we'll have a quick overview of the UDP solution. We'll take a look at a summary of all the new features or the main features that have been introduced. And then we're going to take a look in detail for these particular features. We're going to look at the file share or the UNC path backup capability introduced in UDP 6.5. We're going to take a look at the Office 365 Exchange Online backup. We'll take a look at how we can configure auto discovery and auto protection of VMware VMs. And we're going to take a look at the assured recovery testing and the SLA reports in 6.5 that have been introduced. So let's take a quick overview of UDP. For those of you who have been using UDP for a number of years, this is probably not going to be all that new. But essentially what UDP stands for is Unified Data Protection. The unified part comes in the bringing together of what we had previously as completely separate offerings. We had Arcserve Backup, which is our traditional file-based backup, which typically went to tape, but we also supported disk and cloud destinations as well. We also bring together Arcserve RHA, replication and high availability. So this is a good differentiator for us in the market in that we can provide not only point-in-time recovery, but near synchronous and near real-time failover and high availability for critical systems. And of course, the core of UDP, which is our block-based volume-level backup, which was formerly the Arcserve D2D product. So that's what it was based on. We bring together these three separate products into the unified architecture to be able to provide protection for both physical and virtual machines. Through a unified console, we can provide this protection, and one of the key components to provide the plethora of features and capabilities in UDP is the recovery point server, or the RPS for short. With the recovery point server, which is based on a Windows server, we can provide global deduplication for backups, and then once we have recovery points or backups in the RPS, we can then perform additional features such as replication, instant VM, copy to tape, and more. From a design perspective, there's a few different components to UDP, and we can scale according to what the customer requirements are. We can start with a basic UDP agent installed on a physical server. We can also install it on a virtual machine if need be, and that provides backup going to a NAS, like a file share, or maybe to a USB drive or separate hard drive. These backups can be compressed and encrypted, and if you have multiple machines, we can deploy the agents on each of those and configure them and have the backups go to that NAS or hard drive. Now, if we start having more than half a dozen servers, doing this manually can become time-consuming and a bit cumbersome. So what we can do is add a UDP console. The UDP console gives us central management and reporting. It lets us create plans in one location and have those plans pushed out to the agents on the machines that we're managing. If we add additional servers, we can also push the agent out to these servers through the console, again, making it easier for us to look after a site that has more servers. Furthermore, by having a UDP console, it lets us protect virtual machines using an agentless method. So we can protect VMware and Hyper-V VMs through the use of proxies, and we can protect the VMs on these hypervisor platforms without having to deploy an agent in each of the VMs. Backups are still going to a NAS drive, for example, or a file share. And on top of that, it gives us the capability to do virtual standby. Virtual standby takes a backup image and creates a powered off VM inside the hypervisor, either Hyper-V or VMware. So if our source machine were to fail for any reason, we can, at the click of a button, turn that VM on, and we have a consistent server image ready to run based on that last backup that was available. Now, before I mentioned the real differentiator and the key component for us is the recovery point server. Again, the recovery point server is a Windows-based machine, and in this diagram, the console and the recovery point server are shown separately. That's more for the diagram purposes. But we can have the console and the RPS on the same machine with both of those roles. So when we add a recovery point server into the solution, what we can then do is add additional sources for backup. We can set up a data store or multiple data stores where the backups are going to be kept, and that can be an internal disk, that can be a SAN-based disk, it can be a NAS, and then the additional sources we can protect include the file share and the Exchange Online that we're going to take a look at in more detail in just a moment. Furthermore, once we've got our backups in the recovery point server data store, we can perform additional functions. The data store itself can be deduplicated, so we can reduce the footprint needed when we're storing our backups. We still have compression and encryption options. We keep the ability to do that virtual standby where we convert the backup images, but we also get instant VM. With instant VM, we can pick any recovery point and create a virtual machine from it without having to do a conversion up front. We use a combination of the recovery point or the backup itself as the main source, and any changes are written to a differencing disk, and the use of both of these sources allows us to access and use a VM immediately. If you've got the backups or the recovery points in the data store, we can also perform an offload or a copy to tape. This copy to tape is a full backup, and typically this is useful for providing full backups, maybe monthly or quarterly, and then you can have them stored off-site, and these can be used to meet compliance or regulatory requirements. We can add additional recovery point servers, and we can replicate from one recovery point server to another. And the important thing to note here is, from a licensing, Arcserve licensing standpoint, the use of additional recovery point servers doesn't require any additional cost from Arcserve. As long as you can provision that Windows server and the storage behind it, you can have multiple copies of your data for no additional Arcserve licensing cost. When you replicate recovery points, and if you have a remote hypervisor, we can perform that virtual standby and instant VM capability on that remote hypervisor as well. And similarly, we can do a copy to tape at the remote site. So if you have a host, or if you have a lot of remote offices or branch offices, you can have all of those do local backups to their RPS on site, have all those recovery point servers or RPSs replicate back to a central one, and then from there you can do your copy to tape centrally. So you can eliminate the need for non-IT staff having to perform tasks such as replacing or rotating tapes. That's a very high-level look at how the design of UDP works. We have some additional detail in webinars we've held in the past, and we have a basic series which covers the agent, console, and recovery point service separately, and then we have a featured series that goes through some restore capabilities, how we can do replication, virtual standby, instant VM, and some of the cloud and tape integration we have. So the links are up there. As I said, this webinar will be recorded, so if you want to watch those at a later time and go into a little bit more detail, you're welcome to do that. So let's take a look and go through some of the new features available in UDP 6.5. The new features that have been introduced can broadly be categorized in three main areas. We can have new features in fortified data availability, we have some additional cloud integration, and we've added some capabilities in reporting and orchestration. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at this fortified data availability. In Arcserve UDP version 6.0, which we launched last year, we introduced the ability to do hardware snapshots. Throughout the updates available in version 6, we've been adding some support for additional vendors, and in 6.5 we further added support for HPE 3-path storage arrays, and we've expanded the support for nimble storage arrays. So for both of these platforms we can provide hardware snapshot capability for backups for both agent-based and agentless VM backups for both Hyper-V and VMware. We can provide Office 365 Exchange Online backup. So as more and more workloads are moving into the cloud and using cloud-based services, it's great for reducing the overhead and management complexity for on-site, but it doesn't necessarily solve the data protection issue. So with the ability to provide backups for the Exchange Online mailboxes, you can again provide either business level policy backups and protection, or compliance and regulatory fulfill regulatory requirements by doing backups of those mailboxes online. We've added the ability to do backups of file shares from UNC paths. So this might be, you might have a file server and you don't want to do an entire backup of all the volumes. You might only want to provide a backup or perform a backup of particular shares. Or perhaps in a smaller environment, you have a NAS box, maybe a QNAP or Synology or something similar, which doesn't have the capability of having an agent installed on it. So with this backup from UNC path capability, we can do those backups using a recovery point server as the destination. So again, we're going to take a look at this in a bit more detail a little later on. And of course, we've added new certifications, added support for Windows Server 2016, vSphere 6.5, added updated versions of different Linux distributions, as well as providing support for the Oracle Unbreakable kernel. We did have support for Oracle Linux previously, but using the Red Hat kernel. So now we can provide support for both the Red Hat and the Unbreakable kernel. Moving to cloud integration, we've added a few more features here as well. So we have now the ability to do a copy of a recovery point direct into cloud, specifically into AWS S3. So if you need to perform off-site retention of particular recovery points, we can take it out of our infinite incrementals, make it a standalone recovery point, and store it in the cloud. If you then need to do a system restore, we can pull that recovery point out of the cloud so that you can do your on-prem restore. In terms of restoration into EC2, we can do that now as well. So we've added some enhancements on protecting EC2 instances. I mean, we could always do that with UDP, but we've added some additional enhancements around that, particularly around the restoration of VMs into Amazon AWS EC2. So for Linux systems, we can perform instant VM restores into AWS. So if you have a backup of a Linux machine, we can then create an EC2 instance and do a restore. For Windows, we've added the ability to do virtual standby. So the same virtual standby that we have for on-prem, where we're doing a conversion and creating an instance and having it in a powered off state ready to turn on, we can do a similar thing into AWS EC2 as well now. What this essentially means is that from a DR or remote DR site perspective, it makes using AWS a bit more of a comprehensive tool and a viable way to use it as a DR site. Lastly, from a reporting and orchestration standpoint, a very big feature we've added is the ability to do assured recovery testing. What this is the ability to take a backup image that was made and either create an instant VM or a virtual disk and then run some custom scripts to test it, make sure the data on it is accessible, is readable, and all of this can be done automatically as part of a plan. This ties into the new SLA reports that we have, and we can set different SLA profiles. So you might say that for particular servers, I need to be able to do a file restore within so many minutes or hours. You might define that you need to do a bare metal full system restore in a certain amount of time. You might need to do a VM restore or an instant VM in a certain amount of time. You can specify what those times are within an SLA profile and apply them to particular servers. And then when you do these tests on restores, they'll be timed and compared against what the profile says. And in the dashboard, which we'll take a look at in a moment, you can see whether the SLA profile has been met or if it's been breached. We also have a host of other enhancements. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but there has been a host of enhancements and improvements done, not only in the back end, but also within the interface, being able to have a bit more control when you're creating virtual standby or instant VM in VMware, creating, restarting jobs from failed jobs, being able to do file level restores of VMs without having to load an agent into the VM, and so on. So let's start by taking a look at how the file share or the UNC path backup works. With Arcserve UDP, we've traditionally had to do agent or agentless backups, but at a block level on local drive. As we know with file shares, it's a file level access. So the way we're able to use our infinite incremental technology so that we only need to do one full and then we only need to do incrementals after is through the use of a proxy machine. The proxy machine is running a Windows Server OS and it has our UDP agent installed. And that proxy can be the RPS or the console box, or it can be a separate machine altogether. From there, we can then send the backups to the recovery point server. And then once it's in the recovery point server, we can do the usual tasks such as replicating, doing copy to tape, and so on. The initial destination for the backups needs to be a simple non-dedupe data store, but we've also added the ability to do replication from one data store to another on the same RPS. So there's an optional feature that we can enable replication into a deduplicated data store so that we can get longer term retention with the utilization of much less disk space. Obviously from a restore perspective, we can restore the individual files, or we can actually mount those recovery points that we've made as a drive on a different machine through the agent. With that said, let's take a closer look. So I'm just going to open the Arcserve UDP console now. Just before I get into the file level or the file share backup, I do want to point out and go through the new dashboard. So again, those who have used UDP 5 Update 3 onwards, or UDP version 6, you'll notice that the dashboard that's here is a little different now. This new dashboard still has your backup status, so we have the pie chart here that shows you if you've had successful, failed, cancelled backups, and so on. What we do have here, though, is something different, is the consolidation of the actual backup and the restorable data backup graphs onto a single graph. So this might be a bit confusing to look at up front, but what this graph says, let's take the middle line first. If I was to do an actual, just a raw backup of all my servers, that's going to be about 17 terabytes worth of backup. However, each backup that I do, even though I'm doing incrementals after the initial full, will allow me to restore the entire contents that fills the drive. So if I was to restore every single recovery point I had, I would be able to restore just under 47.5 terabytes worth of data. However, because of the deduplication and compression that is used by UDP, on disk, I'm only using a little over 3 terabytes of hard disk space. So I'm getting, 83% reduction in that data set through the use of Arcserve UDP. From an additional new components in the dashboard, on the far right we have the recovery point objective dashboard. This simply shows how many recovery points I have based on time. So the first one shows how many per month. The middle one shows the age of the newest recovery point. So you can see here I don't have any recovery points or backups that were made in the last 15 minutes. I don't have any that were made in the last hour. But I do have 14 that were made between 1 hour and 1 day ago. And then I have an additional 7 recovery points that were made between 1 and 7 days ago. They're the newest ones that were taken. The oldest recovery points are listed here as well. So you can see here I have a low number of recovery points in the last 30 days. That's the oldest. I have some that have their oldest recovery point between 1 and 6 months. The bulk of my servers have their oldest backup within the last year. So that would make sense if I have a 12-month retention for monthlies, for example. And then I have some more in the older category further there. Here underneath, I have the RTO dashboard, the recovery time objective dashboard. And this is where, after I do particular restore tests, the console is timing it, and it will see whether it has met or hasn't met the SLA profile that I defined. And then underneath, you can see here that I've got some servers that don't have a profile defined, and I haven't tested some either. You can even see that in the bare metal restore, where since installing UDP 6.5, I haven't actually performed a bare metal restore in my lab here. I've done assured recovery tests, virtual machine recoveries, instant VMs, and file restores, and these are shown with these graphs here. With that said, let's now go take a look at the file share backup. So just as before, most of our configuration and setup is done in this Resources tab. When we click on that, by default, we're going to see all the nodes, which are the backup sources. And in my lab, I have a mix of some Windows, Linux machines, servers, desktops, physical, virtual, a whole host of different types of machines. If I want to do a backup of a share, though, what I can do is go straight to creating a plan so that I can protect the share. So to do that, I'm going to click on All Plans here in the left. And again, you can see I already have a number of plans that have already been defined. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Add a Plan, and we'll go through and create one from scratch. So I'm going to call this UNC Path Backup Demo Plan, just to give it a bit of a descriptive name. And in the task type, if you've used UDP 6 or earlier, you'll notice that we have a few extra options in here. So what I'm going to choose is Files on a UNC path. When I select this, the first thing I need to do is define a proxy. So the proxy is going to be a Windows Server machine running 2008 R2 or later with the UDP agent installed. And as I said, you don't have to provision a completely new server just to do this. We can use the RPS, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to use RPS1. I already have my agent on there when I installed the RPS role. I'm going to now click on Add, and I'm going to define what path I want to protect. I'm going to click on Add UNC Path. Now I have a QNAP box that has a USB hard disk plugged into it. So I'm going to connect to that. I'm going to put this path in. I'm going to hit the green arrow, and I'm going to provide my credentials to connect to this particular share. So now this is the top level of the share. If I want to, I can back this up completely, and it will back up all of these folders. However, I don't want to back everything up here. I just want to back up this folder, which I've called Demo Share, and it has some folders that I've created for this demo. I'm going to select that. So I've selected this particular share, and I can hit Save. If I wanted to add another path, I could do that. I can just click on Add UNC Path, and I can go through that process again. Additionally, when we're doing backups of file shares, we have the option to exclude particular files. So we can do exclusions based on file or folder name, including file types and extensions. We can choose to exclude files larger than a certain size, and we can choose to exclude files created or modified before a certain date. So if you only want to back up new files, you can leave the older ones behind. I'm going to leave it all. I'm going to include everything, so I'm not going to exclude anything for this demo. I'm going to go to Destination, and the destination must be a recovery point server, and it must be a recovery point server with a non-deduplicated data store. So in this example, it's defaulted to my RPS1, which has this data store that I've created, and just my naming convention, I put ND at the end to tell me that this is a non-dedupe data store. And in fact, if I try to pick a different data store, it doesn't give me an option. If I had a recovery point server that did not have a non-dedupe data store, such as my second recovery point server, if I select RPS2, this RPS only has one deduplicated data store. And so it's giving me a warning that I need to have a non-dedupe data store. There will be an update coming later that will allow us to do backup directly into dedupe data stores. But at this stage, I can select my non-dedupe data store, and I can provide a password if I want to, or if it was encrypted, I'd provide the encryption password. And then I can go to Schedule. So here I'm going to select how often I want a backup to run. So I want a daily backup to run Monday through to Thursday. That can run at 10 p.m. They can be incrementals. And the first backup will automatically be a full, and then afterwards they'll revert to incrementals. But if I want to do weekly backups as well, I can click on Add. I'll add my backup schedule and choose weekly. That can be run on Fridays, that's fine. And then maybe I want to do monthlies as well. So I can add a backup schedule and choose monthly, and I can choose to do that on the last day of the month at 10 p.m. Save. Now here underneath, I can choose what retention I want to keep for each of these types of backups. But because this is going to a non-dedupe data store, I don't want it to use a lot of disk space. What I can do is I can reduce the retention of these down to 1, and then I can do a replication from this non-dedupe data store into a dedupe data store. And I can choose to have a longer retention in the dedupe data store. So we'll see how that works in just a moment. So I've added these in. If I need to do cataloging, if I'm doing a lot of searches, I want that search to be faster, I can catalog that. If I want to do copy to tape, I need to catalog that. But for now, I'm happy with this. I'm going to go to advanced where I can run pre-post scripts, or I can enable email alerts. Again, I'm going to leave that blank for now. And that's all I need to do, and I can hit save on that, and that will do the backup of the share. Just before I hit save, let's take a look at how we can also do the replication. I'll click on add a task, and we've got task 2, which is now going to be, from the drop-down, I'm going to replicate. You'll also notice there are other tasks I can do, such as assured recovery test, copy to tape, and so on. For now, I'm going to pick replicate. And the source is going to be the backup from task 1, but now I can choose where the destination is. And with UDP version 6.5, I can replicate to a different data store on the same RPS, or I can replicate to a different RPS. So I have both RPSs in my drop-down available. In this case, I want it to go to the same RPS, but I want it to go to my deduplicated data store. So this is the one that I've called a DD on the end for dedupe. Have the settings for timeouts and so on. And then I can go to schedule. By default, the schedule is blank, which means that it will immediately replicate after the backup completes. So this hasn't changed from previous versions of UDP. If I want to put a replication schedule in, I can click add, and I can do that. If I wanted to throttle the bandwidth, if this was going to a different RPS across a WAN, for example, I could choose to throttle the replication. But for now, in this demo, I'll leave those blank. And here is where I can specify my retention. Now, I'm doing a daily backup, but I want to keep 2 weeks worth of backups. My dailies run Monday to Thursday, so I've got 4 backups a week. To protect 2 weeks of dailies, I need to have a retention of 8. I'm doing weekly backups, and I want 1 month's retention, so I'll have 5 on that. And then I want 1 year's worth of monthly, so I'll leave those as 12. I then have custom manual backups. So if I do any ad hoc backups, or if I decided to put a policy in place where I do backups every so many minutes or hours, I could choose to keep those as well. But now I'm happy to keep that down to 1. And then lastly, under advanced, I have options for enabling email alerts here. Now I can hit save, and it'll push the settings out to the proxy, which has the agent, in this case the RPS itself. And that will go through and be successful. There it is. If I go back to my all nodes, I now have my new NAS share in the node list. This is a new source. It has an exclamation mark because the first backup hasn't run yet. So I can right click on that, and I can choose to say backup now if I want. And I'll kick that off. And in a moment, that will see a spinning wheel next to this job to indicate that the backup is running. There it is. And if I now click on the Jobs tab, I can see that it is going to be a full backup, even though I said incremental, because, in this case, I've already done a backup. I'll click Details, and it's doing a backup there. I did a backup when I went through a rehearsal for this webinar, so it's done an incremental. But you can see there, the incremental is relatively quick. I'll go back to the Resources tab. And we'll just give that a little bit of time to complete. In the meantime, if we wanted to do a restore from a share, we can do that a few different ways. So because I've already done a backup from this path before, I can just right-click and I can say restore. This will open the agent on the proxy. And again, if you've used UDP before, we can just do a restore using the restore wizard, or we can mount the recovery point. So in this case, it's looking for the non-dedupe data store. But if I change this, I can point this to my deduplicated data store, which has the longer retention. And just let that connect. So there's my share. Oops. So there's the non-dedupe data store. I want to change this to my deduplicated data store. And you can see here I have a lot more machines that are backed up within this deduplicated data store. So if I go through and find my share, there it is. No, that's not it. The replication is actually running now. But I can find my share. Let's just pick the one on the non-dedupe. And then there is the backup that we made. So that's today's date. I can expand this out. And then I can pick and choose folders or files within that share to restore. Maybe I want to restore the entire lot. Maybe I just want to restore these logs. So I can select the folder, or I can select the files within the folder. And I can go next. I can choose where I want to restore to, how I'm going to resolve the conflict. And maybe I want to restore it to a local folder. And go next. I have a summary of what's going to be restored, and when I hit finish, it'll restore those files. Alternatively, if I cancel this, I can mount the recovery point. So again, this is within the agent. If I click on Mount Recovery Point, there's the backup that we just ran. If I click on Mount, I can mount it as a drive letter, and then whichever machine I'm accessing the agent on, I can go into Windows Explorer, drag and drop files, use whatever tools, just like a normal backup with UDP. I'm just going to close that. Just before I move on, I just want to show you that we've got now replication happening. So if I go to the Jobs tab, we can see some more info. So we have two replication jobs, one going out of the non-dedupe data store and the replication in on the deduplicated data store. So that's going to run for a little bit. We'll let that keep going. The next thing we'll take a look at is the Exchange Online backup. So again, with Exchange Online, what we can do is protect the mailboxes running in Office 365, and this can help against accidental mail deletion or even malicious, deliberate mail deletion. And it goes one step above and beyond the legal hold that can be placed on Exchange Online. So by having backups of those emails, you can go back, take a look at what was there previously, so on, do restores back into the mailbox, into other mailboxes. And just like the file share, we do that through a proxy, and the initial destination is a non-dedupe data store with the option for us to replicate into a deduplicated data store. Once it's in the data store, we can then replicate it to another RPS, copy the tape, send it to the cloud, and so on. Restoration is back into the Office 365 environment, and that can be from the recovery point, the primary location, or from a secondary replicated location. from a licensing perspective, in sites or environments that have a UDP per terabyte capacity-based license, the ability to back up Office 365 Exchange Online mailboxes is included and comes out of that capacity allotment. For environments where you have socket licenses or per OS licensing, we have a subscription license available for Exchange 365, Office 365 Exchange Online backup. So let's take a look at the Exchange Online backup. If I get my console back, we'll go back to the Resources tab, and we're going to go ahead and create a new plan. So I'll go to the Plan section, and I'm going to add a new plan here and call this Exchange Online Backup. The task type will be Office 365 Exchange Online. I'll select that. Just like the file share, I'll need to choose a proxy, and that can be the RPS. And then we're going to choose to add our mailboxes. So I just have a single standalone account within 365 with this particular mailbox. And hopefully I typed the password right. Yes, I did. So when you put that in, if you're the administrator and you can have access to, you see all the mailboxes that are there, what you could do is choose to back up the entire Exchange 365 source. So if any new accounts or mailboxes get added in, they'll automatically be protected as part of the plan. Alternatively, if you only want to protect particular mailboxes, you can go through and select them and add them into the protection list. So I've only got that one mailbox to show right now, so I just added that in. And then you have the option to choose to back up all the folders within that mailbox, or you can choose to exclude particular mailboxes. So maybe I don't want to back up the junk mail. Maybe I don't want to back up sync issues. So I can choose to exclude those. Or if I do want to have everything, I'll just select all folders. Destination is pretty much identical to the file share we saw before. We must go to a non-dedupe data store first. We can choose a schedule. Again, so we've got a daily schedule here. Maybe I don't want to do, or maybe I do want to do 7 days. But I want to replicate into my dedupe data store, so I'm going to reduce my retention down to 1. Under Advanced, I can do my script and email alert options. And just like before, I'll add a task and I'll replicate this. And I'll replicate this to my dedupe data store, and I'll have an increased retention. Maybe I want 28 days of daily. I want a month's retention. And I'm happy to do maybe 5 ad hoc or custom manual backups. Just like before, Advanced gives us email alert options. Once I'm happy with that, I'll hit Save. So now that's applying the settings to the agent on the proxy. That's successful. If I go to all nodes, I can see I now have that email address as a source. And it's got an exclamation mark because the backup hasn't run yet. I can right click and choose to backup now. So I've kicked that off. Again, in a few seconds, I should see a little spinning wheel next to that job. And if I go to the Jobs tab, there's my backup. Now, it can take a while for the initial backup to complete, and that's normal. But the benefit of this setup is once that initial full backup has been completed, we are only doing those incrementals thereafter. So we'll let that back up. From a restore perspective, I should have a previous backup that I've made available. So we right-click on it and click on Restore like we did with the file share before. And in this case, it's showing my non-dedupe data store, which is fine. But let's see if I've got a copy in my dedupe data store that I replicated into. So, okay, no, it's found the one that we've made. I'll go OK. No, I picked the wrong data store. My apologies. This is the dedupe data store. There it is. You can see I've done a backup in the past. So maybe I'll go to yesterday's backup. And go next. And then here we'll show the mailboxes that have been backed up. And so you can see the different folders that are available, and I can drill down and pick, maybe I'll go into my inbox. If I select that, I can see the emails. Maybe I'll choose which emails I want to restore. I can go next. Choose where I want to restore it to, the original location or to an alternate location. So I need to choose a different account and the destination path. So it'll put it into a timestamp folder. And you'll notice that you need to provide the credentials again because the proxy will be connecting into Office 365 to perform that restore. If I provide that, I'll go next. Okay, and then you have the summary, and if you hit finish, it will it'll then perform that restore. So that is a very whirlwind look at the Exchange Online Office 365 backup. Moving on to the auto protection of VMware VMs. So with UDP 6.5, we now have the ability to add a container object as a source in an agentless VM backup plan. Previously, we could only select the VMs themselves, but now we can choose a container, and the container can be something like a data center or a cluster, an individual ESXi server, a resource pool, or folders that are made within VMware. When new VMs are created within this container, they will automatically be detected and backed up using the policy within the plan that the container is in. If the VM is moved out of that container and moved to a different container, it will not be backed up anymore using that particular plan. The old backups will be available, but new backups won't be made using those settings. Of course, if you moved it to a container that belonged to a different plan, that VM will be backed up with that container's policy. You can also choose to exclude VMs within a container. So you might say, back up this particular ESXi server, but I don't want you to back up these 2 or 3 particular VMs as an example. Now in my lab, I don't have a vCenter and I've only got a single standalone ESXi host. So I've got a screenshot here of an example of a bit more comprehensive VMware environment than I have. But that said, let's go ahead and take a look what it would look like and how you'd actually set up the plan. So again, let's bring up the UDP console. Let's go to the Plans section and add a new plan. So let's call this VM Auto Protect Demo Plan. So the task type needs to be a host-based agentless backup. And just like before, we need to use a proxy. Now with VMware, there's a few different ways and a few different places where the proxy can actually reside. So I've already got one set up as another VM called UDP proxy. Now in the past, when we go add, when we're adding nodes from VMware, we could only add those VMs themselves. I'm going to connect into my ESXi host. And again, keep in mind, when doing an agentless backup of VMware, we're leveraging VDDK, so it must be a licensed version of VMware. And you'll notice here, I can select the ESXi host itself. Now, I don't want to protect Demo 03. I'm using that for a different purpose. Ubuntu here is protected by a different plan. Proxy here is protected by a different plan. And this is a virtual standby. So I don't want to protect any of these. But you'll notice I still have the tick next to the ESX01 host. What this means is if any new VMs are created on this host, they will be automatically protected based on the policy that I set in this plan. The rest of these settings are the same, so we can perform the agentless backup and do the quiescing with VMware tools and so on. Destination here will be to a recovery point server. It'll be my deduplicated one. I can set my schedule, so I can choose what policy and how often I want backups to run, just as a normal backup plan before. If I wanted to add a task to do replication or any other actions after that, I can do that as well. I can hit save, and that's all there is to it now. If I create any new VMs, they'll automatically be protected using that particular plan, and the way to restore them will be exactly the same as it's been in previous versions of UDP. The big difference with 6.5, or an additional benefit, is if I'm doing a file restore from an agentless backup, I no longer need to have an agent on the VM to do the restore. I can restore into the VM directly without that agent. Lastly, let's take a look at the assured recovery testing. Again, this is a really beneficial feature because what we can do is, after we've done our backup into the recovery point server, we can stand up that recovery point as a VM or as a virtual disk and attach it to another machine and perform checks on it. We have the ability to run custom scripts, so we can check if services are running, we can do checks on data, if particular folders or files are there, and so on. And the results of these can be plugged into and available within our SLA reports. So to do assured recovery testing, again, let's go back into the console. And what we're going to do is, again, we're going to create a new plan. And I'm going to call it AR Test Demo. And I'm going to add a new machine. I have a Demo 01 machine, which is an agent-based Windows box. So I'm just going to add this in. Now, this first part of the plan that I'm setting up is just a standard backup. So you need to have a standard backup run so that you can then use the recovery point from that backup for the assured recovery test. This Demo 01 is a vanilla Windows install. It just has a C drive. Destination is fine. It'll go to RPS1 deduplicated data store. I'm happy with the schedule. That can just run as is. I'm not changing anything here. Now to do assured recovery, what we do is we add a new task. And you may have seen in one of the drop downs we did a little earlier but assured recovery test is now an additional task. So I click on this. The source, which recovery point do you want to test? Well, I want to test the latest one. So whenever there's the latest backup, I want to test that. Under test settings, we're going to choose whether we want to create a full standalone VM out of it, or whether we just want to create a virtual disk and do like a check disk or other checks on the file system. I want to do an instant VM, and I can choose to do that on vSphere or Hyper-V. I'm going to do it on Hyper-V, and I'm going to do it on VM01. I know that I have resources available there for this. And just like standard instant VM, the proxy server, in the case of Hyper-V, must be the Hyper-V host that you're standing the VM up on. In the case of VMware, it can be the RPS or it can be a different Windows server. So that's automatically selected for me, and you can see I can't change it. Then I have some settings here. What do I want to prefix for the instant VM? I then need to choose where am I going to have my differencing disk. So on VM01, I think I have a folder I've created before for instant VMs, which I have. So I'm just going to select that folder. You can choose how much RAM you want to give it. So I might give this 2 gig of RAM. And then you have options to connect to a network or not. By default, it won't connect the VM to a network so that you don't get a clash. I can tick this, but I've only got one network configured. If I had multiple vSwitches or multiple networks, maybe I could connect it to a network that was a segregated network that I can use for sandbox testing. And you can choose whether you want IP address through the backup or to use DHCP to assign the IP. In this case, I don't want to connect it to my production network, so I'll leave it disconnected. We then go to schedule. Just like the replication, when it's blank, it means that assured recovery test will start immediately after the backup completes. So I'm happy with that. And under advanced, I can choose my timeout properties. If I want to run a custom script for testing purposes, I can define that here, and I can set up email alerts. Once that's done, I can hit save. And again, it'll deploy that setting, and when the backup runs, we'll see it. In terms of the reports, if I go to the reports tab here, I have these new service level agreement reports. So I'll have the recovery point objective report. This is the one that shows how old my recovery points are, the oldest, the newest, and how many I have. And along with the graph, I actually have a breakdown of all the different sources and how many recovery points I have with the oldest and newest date. So I can generate a report and see a list of all of that. The recovery time objective report is the graph that shows whether you've met the SLA, the SLA that you've defined in the profile. So you can see here, I don't have a profile defined for all of my machines. I do have profiles assigned for some of them. And you can see here, it tells you how long it actually took to do the task. So for this Ubuntu machine, it took 11 minutes to recover the entire VM. This SQL server, I created an instant VM from a backup in 1 minute. My SQL server, I did an assured recovery test in 1 minute. Let me see if I have, I've got a file server here. I did a file restore from my file server, and that took a minute. So you can see it met the criteria that I had set based on those SLA profiles. Speaking of which, if you want to create those profiles, we'll go back to the Resources tab, and then right at the bottom there's an SLA profile section. And here we can, I've got one already defined, but let's create a new one. We'll create an SLA profile. You can give it a name. And then you can choose how much time you want to set or what your RTO is for each of these types of restores. So assured recovery test. I want to make sure that my VM is up and assured recovery works within so many minutes, hours, or days. Maybe I have a 5-minute for assured recovery test. Virtual machine recovery. Well, maybe I want a virtual machine to be recovered in 1 hour. Instant VM. Maybe I want an instant VM in 15 minutes. File restore. Well, I need a file restored within 5 minutes. Bare metal restore. Maybe I'm a bit more lenient. Maybe I can have 4 hours for that. And then you can choose what source machines you want these profiles to be assigned to. So maybe I want to assign this to my domain controller and my Exchange server, and we can add those in as an example. You can hit OK. And whenever you run a restore or a test on the machines within the profile, they will be added to the dashboard and into the reports. So the new features that we've added in, as you're probably aware, we have a number of different editions of Arcserve UDP. So we have Standard, Advanced, Premium, and Premium Plus. The ability to back up file shares from UNC paths is available across the board, from Standard all the way up, and of course available in the appliance as well. The Auto VM protection is available from Advanced up, and the appliance itself ships with an equivalent license to Advanced. So whatever is in Advanced and higher is in the appliance, or whatever is in Standard and Advanced is in the appliance. Support for the Oracle Unbreakable kernel and support for virtual standby and instant VM into Amazon is also in Advanced. And just like in UDP version 6, hardware snapshot support is available in Premium and Premium Plus. So the fact that we've added vendor support doesn't change that. It's just hardware snapshots in Premium. And if you have the appliance, you can upgrade the appliance to Premium or Premium Plus, so you can get that hardware snapshot support. And same for the assured recovery test. The ability to do that automated testing comes in at the Premium level. So if you have an appliance and you want to do that assured recovery testing, that's fine. We can upgrade the appliance to Premium Edition as well. I did touch on before for Office 365, if you have a capacity license, it's included. Otherwise, we have subscription licenses, and they're available in 10 user packs in 1 year and 3 year subscription options. That pretty much covers today's session. We're running a little over time, but that's okay. We're almost at the end. Join us for the next webinar where we'll go through some of the other features, such as copy recovery, point to cloud, virtual standby into AWS, and so on. That'll be in 2 weeks' time, same place. There is a different registration link though, so if you want to register, if you haven't already, feel free to follow that link. And again, that webinar will be recorded as well and made available afterwards. If you're interested in any more information, if you want to deep dive, get more detail, or more, if there's any technical or sales or licensing related questions on UDP, RHA, or Arcserve backup, do feel free to reach out and contact us. The contact details are there on screen, and I'll leave that up there and basically jump to any questions that there might be. I can see there's a question about Arcserve accessing user mailboxes. So basically, we're using the proxy to do the connection into Exchange to Office 365 to the Exchange Online environment. In terms of journaling, no. What we're doing is essentially using our agent on the proxy to be the mechanism to get the data from Office 365 into the recovery point server. So it's a different way to how we do Exchange on-prem backup. So there's a question about file shares. So if I have multiple shares on a single NAS device, how does that work? The answer is you can definitely do that. From a licensing standpoint, if you have multiple shares going from the same NAS device, if the source device itself is the same, that will only use the one license if you're using a socket-based license. And you can have multiple shares, that's not a problem. Can we do online SharePoint? At this stage, no, but that is a feature that will be coming. Okay. Assured recovery reports, there's a question about that. So the question is, can those assured recovery reports or the SLA reports be scheduled and sent out? Yes. So with UDP 5 and 6, we've been able to set up a schedule so that an automated report can be generated and sent out based on a particular schedule that you set, whether it's daily or weekly, whatever it might be. So if you're providing a service for customers, if you have those SLA reports, you can have those be generated automatically and sent to you daily in the morning, maybe 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you can review those and send those on to customers as additional evidence that the test's been made. This is how long it took, and the machine stood up fine. All right. I think we have gone a little bit over. If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you for attending today's session. If you do think of any other questions later on, again, please feel free to reach out. We will make the recording link available for this soon. And again, if you had any colleagues that that had other things come up and could not attend the webinar, please feel free to share the link with them. And until next time, thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Arcserve webinar, looking at some more of the new features introduced in Arcserve UDP version 6.5. My name is Armin Jihanian. I'm a pre-sales consultant for Arcserve, and I'll be presenting today's session. Before we get started, during today's session, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the chat or the questions pane to type those questions in, and we'll address those towards the end. During today's session, we'll have a quick overview of what the Arcserve UDP solution entails. We'll have a summary of the new features that have been introduced in UDP 6.5, at least the key new features. And then we'll take a look in detail how to use and implement some of the new features, specifically how to copy recovery points to cloud, how to perform virtual standby into AWS, and how to perform instant VM into AWS. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar of the new feature series. And if you missed the first webinar where we covered file share backups, Office 365 Exchange Online backups, and automated VM protection and SLA reporting, there'll be a link in a few slides' time that shows the URLs where you can watch that webinar on demand. With that, let's take a quick look at Arcserve UDP. For those of you who have already used Arcserve UDP or are using it already, none of this will be a huge surprise. But what Arcserve UDP does is brings together what were previously 3 separate products in the form of Arcserve backup, which was our traditional file-based backup primarily to tape. Arcserve replication and high availability, or Arcserve RHA, which gives us our near real-time byte-level replication and automatic failover capabilities, as well as the Arcserve UDP core component, which is based on the former Arcserve D2D product. So by bringing these together, what we're doing is we're bringing them into a unified architecture, and that's where the UDP name comes in. So Arcserve UDP stands for Unified Data Protection. With Arcserve UDP, we can protect both virtual and physical machines, and we can manage these through a unified console. We can start from a basic data protection and go up to quite sophisticated features available in the product. And the bulk of our differentiation in the market and our competitors comes from the use of our recovery point server. This is a Windows server where we can enable global source-side dedupe. So any backups going into a data store on the recovery point server can be deduplicated at the source, meaning you save not only disk space from the deduplication, but you're also saving on bandwidth as well as the time it takes to perform a backup. Once we have data in a recovery point server, we then have the ability to perform additional functions such as replicating that, performing virtual standby or instant VM, performing copy to tape, and so on. Let's take a look in a bit more detail how the solution goes together. As I mentioned, we can start with a very basic data protection model using Arcserve UDP. If you have a physical server, or indeed if you have a virtual server and you want to protect and back that up, we can start by deploying an agent onto that machine. We can log into that agent, configure the backups, and the backups can be sent to a file share, whether on a NAS or a file server, or to another hard drive, maybe a USB hard drive as an example. The backups we perform can be compressed, and we can encrypt them for additional security. If you have multiple machines, then we need to deploy and configure the agents on those separately. Now, when you start having more than a handful of servers, this can become quite time-consuming. So what we can then do is add what we call the UDP console into the environment. The UDP console is a Windows-based machine, and we can log into the console and we can centrally configure plans which contain all our backup policies, the sources, the schedules, and so on. And from the console, we can manage the agents and push all these settings in the plans out to the agents. At the same time, if we add more servers into our environment, from the console, we can actually push the agents out to these new machines. Furthermore, once we add a UDP console in the mix, we can also do agentless backups of Hyper-V and VMware VMs. To do this, we employ the use of a proxy machine, which again uses our agent, and the destination is to a share again. And once we have our console in place, we can also perform features such as virtual standby. With virtual standby, we take a backup image as the source, and using that, we will create a powered-off VM in Hyper-V or VMware, and now in 6.5, also in Amazon AWS, and we can create a powered-off VM that has the data consistent as of that backup source, ready to turn on in the event the original machine fails, or if we want to bring up that server as a migration or as in a new destination. The last piece is that recovery point server that I mentioned before. So with the recovery point server, and note that in this diagram, the recovery point server and the UDP console are shown as two separate machines, but this is just for the diagram. In real life, in real deployments, we can have the console and the recovery point server on the same machine if you like. With that said, once we introduce a recovery point server role, we need to configure a data store. This is where the backups are going to be saved and kept. This can be on a local disk or a SAN-based disk, or it could be on a share. Once we add a recovery point server, we can also enable things such as the Exchange Online backup from Office 365, as well as backups from UNC paths or file shares. As I mentioned, we can enable deduplication on these backups to the recovery point server, and of course we still have compression and encryption as options as well. We still have the ability to perform virtual standby, but we now also add the ability to perform an instant VM. Instant VM is related to virtual standby in that we're creating a virtual machine, but the way we do it is slightly different. With instant VM, we're not doing a conversion and creating that powered off VM ready to turn on. What we're doing instead is we're creating a VM when needed, and we are using a combination of the original recovery point, the backup, as the source image, and we're then using what we call a differencing virtual disk to store any changes or new writes. So by doing this, we can stand an instant VM up without needing any additional disk space up front. However, the performance might be a little slower than a traditional virtual standby. If you plan on using an instant VM on a more long-term basis, we can perform tasks such as a vMotion or a VM replication to get the data onto a full-speed disk on the hypervisor. That said, we also can perform copy to tape. What copy to tape does is it takes a recovery point in the recovery point server, it'll rehydrate that to full and send it to tape. The benefit of this is that because we have a full copy of the data on tape, we can perform an individual file or folder restore directly from the tape without having to do a dump restore of our data store itself. We see customers using this typically on a monthly or perhaps quarterly basis, where they're then performing a full backup of their environment and sending it to tape for long-term retention for compliance or legal reasons. I also mentioned we can do replication. If you have an additional recovery point server, we can replicate recovery points or the backups from one recovery point server to another. Once that data is replicated, we can then perform tasks such as remote instant VM and remote virtual standby. Or we can do a remote copy to tape. If you have multiple sites, maybe branch offices, they can all replicate back to a central location, and then that can perform a copy to tape, so that you don't have to invest in putting tape devices in all of the sites, and you don't have to worry about non-IT staff having to perform tasks such as tape rotation. So you can see here we started with a really basic way to do backup of a single server, but the UDP product is flexible enough to grow with your environment as it grows. That was a very high-level overview, and we have held some webinars in the past that covered different components. Now, if you want to watch those webinars on demand, the links are on the screen there. I'll leave them for just a few seconds. We had a basic series which covered the agent, the console, and the recovery point server separately, and we went into some detail about the functionalities you can get with those components. We then expanded on that with the features series, where we added the webinars to show how you can perform bare metal and granular restores, how to do replication, virtual standby and instant VM on-prem, and then we're looking at cloud and tape integration. We've also, last time we had our webinar 1 on the UDP 6.5 new features, where we looked at the UNC or file share backup, Exchange Online backup, assured recovery, and VM auto protection. So the webinar link to view that on demand is also on screen. So let's take a quick look and see a list of all the key new features that have been introduced in UDP 6.5. These can be classified in three broad areas: fortified data availability, further cloud integration, and expanded reporting and orchestration. What does this mean? For fortified data availability, what this means is we've added additional support for hardware snapshots for array-based systems. So in UDP version 6, we introduced hardware snapshotting by adding support for NetApp arrays. We also, in an update in UDP 6, we added support for nimble arrays for Hyper-V and agent-based backups. And now in 6.5, we've further enhanced that by adding support for nimble for VMware. So now we support all Hyper-V, VMware, and agent-based backup for nimble. We've also added that support for HPE 3-part arrays. As we saw in some of the previous slides, and as I mentioned, we've added support for Office 365 Exchange Online backups. So we can protect mailboxes that are running in Exchange Online. We can back those up and bring them down and hold them on-prem. We can do restores back into the cloud and so on. So we've got that extra peace of mind that can be gained through having a local backup of your emails, even if you're using Exchange Online. Backup from UNC parts or file shares. This allows us to perform backups of shares on systems that perhaps didn't have agent support or weren't virtual machines with previous versions of UDP. And this includes NAS devices. Perhaps you might have a Synology or a QNAP type NAS box, and we can now protect data on those shares using Arcserve UDP 6.5. And we've also added new certifications. We've added support for Windows Server 2016, updated support for vSphere, Red Hat, added support for the unbreakable kernel with Oracle Enterprise Linux. From a cloud integration, this is what we'll be focusing on today. So we've added the ability to perform a copy recovery point to cloud, specifically into AWS S3. So we'll see how we can configure that in an upcoming slide. But we can also perform enhanced protection of both EC2 instances, but also do restore into EC2 through different methods. So what we're going to do is we can perform virtual standby into Amazon AWS EC2 for Windows hosts, and we can perform instant VM recovery for Linux hosts into AWS EC2. So we're going to take a look at how we can perform both of these and what the requirements are. And essentially what this does is it makes it a lot more feasible to utilize AWS as a remote DR site if you need to. Lastly, from expanded reporting and orchestration, we added the automated testing for Windows and Linux. This is called the Arcserve Assured Recovery feature. Allows you to automatically create a VM or create a virtual disk from the backup that was just made, and you can then run custom scripts against it to test if the backup is functional, if the data you need is there, and if particular services you need will start from that backup image. We've added the ability to create more detailed SLA reports, so we can get both RTO, recovery time objective reports, and RPOs, recovery point objective reports. RTOs will let you see how long it takes to actually perform different types of restores, and you can create SLA profiles where you define how many minutes, hours, or days you need, or what your SLA needs to be, what your RTO needs to be to do those restores. So for example, for file-based restores, you might say, I need to be able to perform a file restore in less than 15 minutes. For an instant VM, you might say, I need to be able to create an instant VM in less than 30 minutes. If you're doing a VM restore, maybe I need to restore an entire VM in less than 2 hours. Or if I'm doing a complete bare metal restore, maybe I have a 4-hour window for that. So when you go ahead and test and perform these different kinds of restores, UDP will time them and compare them against what you've set in the profile, and you can generate a report to see if that SLA has been met or if it hasn't been met. Of course, there's also been a lot of additional enhancements, improvements made, not only in the back end, but some changes and updates in the user interface as well. For example, when creating VMware-based instance VMs or virtual standby, you can choose the disk controller type. We can do the automatic VM protection for VMware VMs, and a host of other enhancements just listed there. Now let's take a look at the features that we'll be focusing on today. First one being the copy recovery point to cloud. From UDP's first release, we've had the ability to perform a copy of recovery point. In fact, copy recovery point was a feature that was available even with Arcserve B2B. What copy recovery point does is it lets you take a particular backup, maybe your daily or weekly or monthly, and it will make that recovery point a standalone recovery point, meaning it's a full recovery point that doesn't need any other fulls or incrementals previous to that. It'll make it a standalone recovery point, and it will let you copy it to another location. Previously, that was to another drive or to a share. With UDP 6.5, we've also now added the ability to send a copy of that recovery point to Amazon S3. We can configure this so that the copy recovery point is done automatically for particular backups and then sent into S3, or we can perform a manual upload of a recovery point into Amazon S3. Essentially what this lets you do is keep those standalone backups in cloud on a more cost-effective storage tier in the cloud, being object store. If you then need to do a restore, you can download the recovery point and do a local restore as you would normally. With that said, let's take a look at how we'd actually configure and perform this. So I'm just going to open my Arcserve UDP console. So logging in, we will come up with the dashboard. So we'll see the status of backups, recovery point, recovery time, reports, and so on. From here, we're going to go to the Resources tab, because that's where we do most of our configuration. And in the Resources tab, you'll see here I have a list of different servers. I have a mix of physical, virtual, Windows, Linux, server workstations, and so on. What we're going to do is going to configure and update a plan so that we can perform regular copies of recovery points into S3. Now what I'm going to do, I want to do this on my domain controller. So I have a backup of my domain controller image in the cloud. Right now I can see that this is my domain controller. I've called it DC01, and this is part of this DC01 backup plan. So what I'm going to do is go to All Plans. I'm going to select my DC01 backup plan. So if I click on this, I'll go in to modify it. You can see here I already have a number of different tasks being performed on the backup for this image. I'm replicating it, I'm performing a local virtual standby, and I'm doing a copy to tape. I'm going to click on Add a Task. So here if I click Add a Task, it's going through and checking the different connectivity for the previous task. And now I've got task 5 here, and I can choose what that task type is going to be. So I'm going to say copy recovery points from this drop-down. I'm going to choose which backups I want to perform a copy. So I want to do a copy of my weeklies and monthlies into the cloud. I'm not too worried about my dailies. So for weeklies and monthlies, let them copy in. I then go to copy settings, and then I can choose the destination. So this could be a local disk or a shared folder, and I'd put the path in there. But what we want is cloud storage. We're going to choose cloud, and in the drop-down list for the service, we've got the choice of Amazon S3 or S3 compatible. S3 and S3 compatible are obviously very similar options. With S3, we can choose to add an S3 account in if we don't already have one. And you'll notice that we only have a small subset of the bucket regions within the S3 option. What we can do is we can choose S3 compatible, and we can add a service in. And when we choose an S3 compatible account, we can define the storage endpoint. So if we wanted to send to Sydney, for example, we can put the Sydney endpoint address in, put in our credentials in, and a bucket name. Now I've already done that. So in the drop-down, I've created this storage account that we're using in this bucket. We're going to choose compression and encryption options. And then once we've configured the copy settings, we're going to the schedule. And we're going to choose when we want the copy recovery point to happen. Now, by default, this is blank, which means that immediately after the backup finishes, it'll perform a copy to cloud or the copy recovery point task. We can then also choose what the retention or how many recovery points we want to keep in our destination, i.e. cloud. So I'm happy to keep 1 weekly and 1 monthly. That's going to be my, if there's a complete site failure and I've lost everything, I know that I have a backup. My last weekly and my last monthly are going to be available in the cloud. If I wanted to put a schedule in, I can click Add, and then Add Recovery Point Job Schedule, and I can choose which days of the week to run and what the start and end times are going to be. This is for the kickoff. So once the job has started replicating, it'll continue until it actually copies the recovery point. It won't stop the copy when this time is reached. It's only this is the time during which it can start the copy. But for me right now, I'm happy to let the copy run immediately after backup. I'll hit save. And now what it's going to do is going to push those settings to the agent on that particular machine. And then the next time that a backup runs, it'll perform a copy of the recovery point of the weekly and monthly when those particular backups run. Now, while that's pushing out, we also have the ability to perform a manual upload of recovery points into the cloud as well. So to do that, we're going to click on All Nodes. And we just need to wait for the plan to deploy, which it has. And then if I want to perform a copy recovery point, I can right-click on this node. And then in the menu that pops up, there's an option to upload recovery point to cloud. So I can click on that. I can choose which recovery point I want to copy. So this is my daily backup, the last one that ran yesterday at 11:30 at night. Let's say I want to copy this. I'll select the recovery point that I want to copy. I'll go next. I'll choose which cloud service or which account I want to use. So I'm using my S3 compatible Sydney destination. standard compression and no encryption is fine. And I'll hit finish. And what this will do is then kick off the copy recovery point into the cloud. So in a few seconds, we should see a spinning wheel next to this. And now that that's spinning, if we go to jobs, we can see that the copy recovery point job is in progress. If we click on details, we can get some more information about what's happening. Now, in this case, this image is about 32.5 gig, and depending on how fast your internet connection and link is, obviously this could take from, depending on how big it is, from maybe an hour or two to days. So it really does vary. I'm going to let this run in the meantime, so I'm just going to close this window. And we'll go back to our Resources tab. And then if you want to then download a recovery point from the cloud, you can right-click on the machine in question, and then there's a Download Recovery Point from Cloud option. So if we click on this, we'll choose, our source. So I've got the Sydney account here. Now, obviously, it hasn't finished uploading anything, so we don't have any recovery points in the cloud. But if we did, we'd select it and we'd click Next, and then we would choose the destination on where we want to save that recovery point. Once that's back on-prem, we can perform a mount recovery point, we can perform a bare metal restore, we can browse or find files or folders in that recovery point. All the recovery options that are available to us normally will be available on that recovery point as well. Okay. Let's take a look at virtual standby now into AWS. So virtual standby is available for Windows hosts, and what it does is it lets us, as I said, take a recovery point or a backup that we've performed and use that as a source and create a powered off VM or an EC2 instance in this case. And what we do is we take that and create the relevant EBS and the instance behind it and have that as a powered off instance ready to turn on when needed. What we can also do is, if we're using an RPS server in EC2, we can replicate the recovery point from one RPS to the other. What this does is it lets us replicate the deduped data, which makes it a WAN optimized replication. And because if we do the conversion or the creation of the virtual standby from the RPS in the cloud in EC2, the data is local to the cloud, which will make that conversion and creation quicker. That said, you don't have to have that RPS in the cloud, but in both instances, you do need to have a Windows instance running in EC2 to act as a proxy for the virtual standby. That Windows instance needs to have the Arcserve agent installed in it, and of course, the proxy needs to be able to communicate with the UDP console and the recovery point service. So let's take a look at how we configure this in the console. So I'll go back to my UDP console. So what we're going to do is perform a virtual standby for this demo O2 machine here that I've been backing up. So this is part of this agentless Hyper-V plan. And just to show you, we can actually do this conversion across hypervisors. So I'm going to go to Plans. I'm going to go to my agentless Hyper-V plan. And it's doing a backup at the moment. What I want to do now is add another task. And this task will be a virtual standby. Now, if I did have If I did want to use an RPS in Amazon EC2, what I could do is perform a replicate task first that goes to the RPS in the cloud. And then when I add virtual standby, here in the source where it says destination of task 1, I would have an additional option that says destination of task 2 replicate. So I could choose the replica as the source for my virtual standby. For now, I'm just going to choose the backup that I've done on-prem. And then here in the virtualization server, I have options for VMware or Hyper-V. These are if I am doing an on-prem virtual standby or a remote virtual standby into a DR site or maybe to a colo where I have equipment that I can manage, the Hyper-V or the VMware host that I can manage. To go to cloud, I'll select EC2. And here, I can choose an account name. Now, I've already got one created, but if we were to add a new account, we would just put in the name that you want to give it, the label, and then we're going to choose which EC2 account to create. So we'll do that. Provide your access key ID and secret access key and go OK, and it'll use those account credentials. As I said, I've already created one, so I'm going to select my account here. And then we're going to select the region. So here we've got, I'm going to choose Sydney in this list. And then we need to define which Windows instance in AWS are we going to be using as the proxy. So I'm going to click on this, and it automatically is seeing what machines I have running in AWS against the account that I've chosen. So I've actually got an instance here that I've named proxy. I do have an RPS running in Amazon, even though I'm not using it. So I could use the RPS itself as a proxy if I wanted to, and I have a Linux box, and that's to show the instant VM later. For now, I'm going to choose the AWS proxy. This is just a Windows 2012 R2 instance. And then I need to provide the username and the password. Now, oops, I have to get my account details here, so bear with me. So I have not joined this instance to my domain, so I will have to use the local admin password. Once you put those details in, we can then click on virtual machine. If there are any issues or errors with the credentials or details you provided, you'd get an error message. But for now, we can now configure the virtual machine setting. So what this is going to do is it's going to create an instance, and it's going to put this UDP VM underscore before that name. We also have the ability to choose how many snapshots we want to keep in the virtual standby. So we can keep up to 29 snapshots. What this means is if we need to start the virtual machine instance, we can pick which snapshot to apply to the image. So you're not limited to starting the last backup. For example, if you were hit by crypto lock and you didn't realize for 2 or 3 days, but you have the last 5 days of backups as snapshots available on the virtual standby, you could start the virtual standby instance with an image or the backup from 3 days ago or 4 days ago. We then have the option to choose the instance type. So there's the different types of instances available within EC2. So I'm going to start this as a small instance. We can choose what kind of EBS volume you want to use. So I'm happy with the general purpose. If you, depending on what your network settings are and your security groups in Amazon, you can choose what's available. So I've just got some defaults here, which I'll select. And then under advanced, you can choose what the heartbeat is. So you can choose to check how often You're going to check against the source if it's running, and whether you want to enable email alerts. You also have the option of adding a throttle for the data transfer. So if you have a limited pipe going into the internet, if you add a throttle, you can choose a particular limit in megabits or kilobits, and you can choose, maybe I only want to use 1 megabit of traffic between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday to Friday, so that it doesn't impact my business if they need to use the internet for business purposes. So I can put a throttle schedule in if I need to as well. Once that's done, I hit save. Again, what it will do is it'll push all these settings out to the hosts or to the agents on the proxy in this case, because it's an agentless backup. If I come to all nodes, that's currently deploying. Now, if I go to the jobs list, I actually have a virtual standby that I started earlier, and this is going into the cloud as well. So this is for a server called Demo01. If I look at the details here, my link is not the greatest or the fastest link, so it's been taking quite a bit of time to copy this 23 gig up. But this is going into AWS. If I take a look in my EC2 management console, you'll be able to see the 3 instances that we saw before. I have my Linux instance that's running as a Linux backup server. I have my proxy machine, which we just used now for the virtual standby, and I have my RPS that's running in the cloud as well. You'll also notice that this UDP VM Demo01 instance has been created that is currently stopped. So what's happening now, if I go back to my UDP console, this upload, it's uploading all this data into an EBS volume attached to that powered off instance. So once this completes the upload, I'll be able to power on that instance, and it will be as if I've powered that Demo01 machine on from its last backup. So coming back to resources here, you can still see it's deploying, and now it's deployed. So what will happen is the next time the backup runs, this will automatically create the virtual standby into the cloud. Lastly, let's take a look on how to do instant VM into Amazon AWS. So with instant VM, as we said, it's related to virtual standby. And while it's similar in some respects, the way that we go about doing restores is different. So with instant VM, to do instant VM, first of all, it's only available for Linux machines being protected. And in order to use instant VM into Amazon, we need to have a recovery point server in the cloud that has a recovery point from a Linux server replicated to it. We also need a Linux instance to be running in the cloud that has the Arcserve UDP agent for Linux installed on it. And that machine is referred to as a Linux backup server. And its role is similar to the virtual standby proxy. The creation of the instant VM and the sending of the data to the instant VM is achieved through the Linux backup server itself. So if you've got those 2 components in place, we can then perform instant VM into Amazon AWS for Linux machines. So let's take a look at how that works. Again, I'll go back to my console. And then what we've got is this machine here, I've got an Ubuntu VM, and I'm backing that up with this agentless backup, and that's called agentless VMware. So this is running on a VMware host I have. If I go to plans, and if we go to agentless VMware, you can see that I have the backup task for this Ubuntu VM, and then I'm replicating it. So if I click on replicate, the destination is going to my RPS in the cloud, AWS RPS. So I'll cancel that. And if I go in my console, if you're familiar with the UDP console, if we click on recovery point servers here under destinations, you can see I have a third recovery point server with a data store. And so this is backed up, this is holding just over 15 gig of data, but I'm getting 61% dedupe, 41% compression. So even though I'm backing up and holding 15 gig of data, I'm only using just under 3.5 of actual disk space. All right, so now that I've established that I have, my recovery point server in the cloud, I've replicated, and if I go into the data store here, I have 5 recovery points for this Ubuntu machine. So all my prerequisites are fine. And if I click on Linux backup server groups, you can see that I have this EC2 instance as my Linux backup server as well. So that's already added in as well. If that wasn't there, I can click on Add Nodes, and then I can choose to add a Linux backup server node, and then I would provide my credentials and details for that machine in here and click Add to List. But again, I've already gone ahead and done that, so there's my Linux backup server showing in my list, which means I can go to my node list and I can right-click on this Ubuntu machine, and then I can say create an instant VM. So I'm going to create an instant VM, and by default it'll show me the first recovery point where the backup goes to, which is RPS01. But I don't want RPS01, I want AWS RPS. So I'm going to select the RPS in the cloud. That's the data store. And then let's say I want to stand up the latest backup. So by default, it highlights the latest recovery point. I'm okay with that. We'll select that. We'll then go next. It's automatically detected that we're running in EC2. If we needed to change the cloud type, we could. Choose the account we're going to use, and then we're going to go next. We then need to select the Linux backup server. So this is the proxy essentially that will be used. So we'll go through the one we have. And then we need to set the VM settings. So we can put a description in. You can see here it automatically puts an UDP IVM underscore prefix before the node name. So I'm happy with that, that's fine. I want to run it in Sydney, so that's fine. And then the instance type, this can be a small instance as well. General purpose is fine. Network settings and all of that is fine. I'm happy to let it auto assign an IP. Select the security group, and we can hit finish. You can choose whether you want to boot now or boot later. So we can say boot now. And then you can see it's in the process of going through and creating that instant VM. That's pretty much all it is for the Linux instant VM in Amazon. Now, just to give a bit of an update on the new features and functions in UDP 6.5. With UDP, as we had with the previous version, with UDP 6.5, we have 4 server editions and we have the Arcserve UDP appliance. So the capabilities available on the different editions from a new features perspective, we can perform backup of UNC paths with all editions of UDP. If you want to do auto VM protection for VMware, if you want to do instant VM or virtual standby into Amazon EC2, or if you want support for the Oracle Unbreakable kernel, then you need UDP Advanced or higher, and the appliance will also do that. And then if you want to take advantage of hardware snapshotting on HPE 3PAR, Nimble, or NetApp, or if you want to be able to perform the assured recovery tests and SLA reports, you'll need UDP Premium or Premium Plus. If you have the appliance, there is an upgrade option that lets you add the premium features to the appliance. For Office 365 backup, that's included with the appliance, and it's also included on all managed capacity licenses. So in that case, basically whatever backup size your Exchange Online takes comes out of your allowance for those licenses. Otherwise, if you're using a per OS or per socket license, there's an optional subscription available to be able to back up Exchange Online. These subscription licenses are available as 10 user packs, and you can get them in 1 year and 3-year subscription options. With that, I'll open it up to questions. Before we get into that though, if you are interested in a deep dive, or if you're after any more information, whether it's of a technical or commercial nature, please feel free to reach out to us. We have my contact details as well as my colleagues, Andrew Huntley and Dean Schroeder. I'll leave our contact details on screen for the time being, and I'll open it up if anyone has any questions. So I've got one here asking about, do I need to have a recovery point server in the cloud for virtual standby? The short answer is no, but if you do have if you are using one, or if you want to use one, it can speed up the creation of the virtual standby instance, because getting the data into the cloud, you'll be replicating deduped and compressed data from one RPS to another RPS, and then from the RPS in the cloud, it'll be able to create the virtual standby instance quicker. Another question about copy recovery point. When copying it to S3, does it send the whole recovery point? Yes. So with copy recovery point, what we're doing is, if it's an incremental, we're taking a copy of that out of the chain, we're making it a standalone full recovery point, and then sending that into cloud. That said, you do have the option to compress it, and you also have option to encrypt it. So it won't necessarily be the full size of the backup, but you might get some saving due to compression, but the amount of saving will depend on the data type. But to answer the question, yes, when you do copy recovery point to S3, it does a copy of the whole recovery point. Another question that come up here. It's make it easier to read. There's a question about an objective to put monthly full backups to tape using the least media possible. Is there a way to use the copy recovery point to copy each object monthly full backup to another deduplicated data store, or to modify a replicate feature to only replicate a monthly full backup to another deduplicated data store? The short answer is yes. So to completely automate it, you can replicate from one data store to another data store. Previously, you had to have two separate RPS servers to do that. With UDP 6.5, we can do that on the same RPS, so you can have set up two separate data stores. If your objective is to shut down the data store and just have that on tape, what you could do is a two-step process. You could do a copy recovery point and then import that or jump start that into a data store. But realistically, there's a lot of ways that we can get a copy of the data store and back that up. And within the Arcserve UDP solution guide, there's also a section on how to back up the data stores to tape. So if you back up the data store to tape, you're backing up the entire data store in a deduplicated state, and you'll have a copy of all of the recovery points available. However, in order to restore from that, you would need to dump the entire contents of the data store first to a recovery point server. So yes, there are ways to do it. Copy recovery point might not be the most efficient way, but we do have ways to achieve having a separate deduplicated copy of your data. So there's a question about the copy recovery point. Can it be done over a standard internet connection? The answer is yes, but again, depending on how much data you have, it could take a bit of time. So with my internet connection that I have, it's taken over 24 hours to do a copy. It might take another 24. So one that that will be the deciding factor on feasibility and how often you can do that. Okay. Taking a look at the time, if there are no other questions, I'll probably leave it at that. I'd like to thank you for attending. If there are any other questions you think of afterwards, again, my details are on screen. Please feel free to send an email or give me a call. More than happy to answer any questions that may come up afterwards. But until our next webinar, I'd like to say thank you and see you next time. Thanks.